You know that eerie feeling when something's not quite right? That's how it started in our village. I remember the day clearly. 3 children, their skin an unnatural shade of green, emerged from the ground near the old oak tree. Just emerged, like seedlings breaking through soil, except they were fully formed children. At first we tried to help them, who wouldn't? But there was something wrong. Mrs. Thompson was the first to notice. She thought she was feeding her chickens, but in reality she was throwing their feed into the well. When we asked her why, she insisted she saw her chicken coop right there. But it wasn't. It was our village well. Then it happened to others. Old man Jenkins believed he was tending his garden, but he was actually destroying his own house piece by piece. He'd smile and talk about his beautiful tomatoes while tearing down his walls. We tried to stop him, but he couldn't see what he was really doing. The children, they were always watching, always smiling. They never spoke, just observed. And wherever they went, reality seemed to bend. People would see what wasn't there, do things they never meant to do. Mr. Roberts walked straight into the forest thinking he was heading to the market. We found him 3 days later, confused and babbling about green lights. I started noticing patterns. The children would appear near someone, and within days that person would start acting strange. It was like they were planting seeds of chaos in people's minds, watching them unravel like loose thread from a sweater. The worst part? We couldn't stop it. How do you fight something that makes you question your own reality? Some villagers tried to leave, but they'd end up walking in circles, convinced they were heading straight out of town. Last week I saw them standing outside my window, their green skin glowing in the moonlight, those empty eyes staring right through me. I've been writing this down to keep track of what's real, but now I'm not sure if I'm actually writing, or if I'm doing something else entirely. The children are here now watching me. They're smiling again, and I think I'm starting to smile too. It feels like years have passed, but it's been only days. You might remember me as the storyteller who shared that bizarre tale about the green children. Well, buckle up, because there's more to this story than I initially let on, and it's time you knew the whole truth. I've seen my share of strange things, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. Those children, they weren't just lost souls who stumbled into our village. They were calculating, manipulative beings who knew exactly what they were doing. You see, after causing chaos in the village, driving people to the brink of madness with their otherworldly presence, they turned their attention to me. Maybe they sensed my military background, or perhaps they knew about my involvement with the secret forest laboratories we'd built for our experiments. Yes, you heard that right. Experiments. There's a reason I didn't mention this part before. Deep in those woods, hidden from prying eyes, we had facilities that would make your skin crawl. The kind of place where the line between science and the supernatural became increasingly blurred. And somehow these children knew. They tried to use this information against me, tried to manipulate their way into gaining access to our facilities. The way they would speak in their strange language when they thought I wasn't listening, the way their eyes would dart toward the forest where our labs were hidden, it was all too calculated. They weren't innocent victims. They were predators wearing children's skin. Those late nights when they would whisper among themselves, their green skin seeming to glow faintly in the darkness. I started documenting everything. Every movement, every strange behavior, every attempt they made to extract information about our operations. They thought they were playing me. But years of military training taught me to always stay one step ahead. One thing's certain. They weren't just lost children who stumbled out of a cave. They were part of something much bigger, much darker, and I'm finally ready to share that truth with you.
I thought the silence was worse than their smiles. But I was wrong. 3 nights ago, the silence broke. It started faint, like wind slipping through a cracked door. But then I realized it was voices, not from them. From us, familiar voices. My mother's laugh, though she hasn't laughed since the famine. My friend's prayer, whispered word for word in the exact way he says it at night. Even my own voice, repeating things I'd spoken in secret, things no one else should know. And always, the sound came from the direction of the children. At first, people thought it was an echo, a trick of the valley, but the words sharpened. Intimate, personal, secrets dragged out into the open. I watched my neighbor collapse to his knees, when he heard his dead father calling from the tree line. His lips trembled like a boy again, whispering, "Papa." Then he stumbled forward into the dark. We never saw him again. Another woman swore she heard her child's voice, a child who'd been buried months ago. "Come play, Mama," it said. She dropped the lantern and followed. The light went out in seconds. Then Mr. Clark. He swore he heard his wife screaming, crying for help. He ran into the woods barefoot, his arms thrashing at branches. His wife was still in bed, fast asleep. Now, every night, the line of villagers grows thinner. They vanish into the woods, following the calls of the dead, the living, the loved. Everyone hears someone, everyone except me, because the voices I hear aren't calling me into the woods. They're already here, whispering directly in my ear, from inside my house.
Last night I saw them, not outside, but inside. Two green glows, faint but steady, shining from the upstairs window of the Miller house. The house has been abandoned for months. Everyone in the village knows it. Dusty curtains, boarded doors, nothing left alive in there. Yet still, those lights were watching. I told myself it was the moon or lantern glass catching the dark. I told myself anything, until the lights blinked. Was super weirdy, couldn't move. My whole body froze. Caught in a silence so heavy it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. And then like something pulling invisible strings, I started walking closer. Step after step, gravel crunching under my boots, the sound echoing far too loud against the night. The closer I got, the more I could hear it. Breathing, slow, measured, not my own, from inside the house. From behind that very window, I finally forced myself to look in, and what I saw was nothing. An empty room, coated in dust and cobwebs. But on the glass, pressed against the inside, were two handprints, small child's, as though someone had been standing there only moments before. I ran. I told myself it was over, but when I reached my home, I looked up, my bedroom window, and there they were again. Two faint green glows, waiting for me. From inside my own house. Dude, I was like, please, just get it over.
You all warned me. You said the children were devils. But I saw them as starving little things, puvering, watching me from the tree line. What kind of man turns his back on children? So I baked for them. Bread warm from my oven. I left it on the stones by the woods, whispering a prayer. I thought, maybe kindness could cure whatever curse they carried. But when I returned at dawn, the loaves were wrong. Not eaten, not broken, hollow, carved out from the inside like empty shells. The crust crumbled like ash, but oh, the smell. It wasn't rot, no, it was sweet, sweet like honey, sweet like nothing in this world. I tore off a pea steam, curling from bread. Though my oven was cold, I tasted it. It filled me. My veins sank, my teeth blackened, but I laughed. Oh, how I laughed, because I understood. This was not bread for the body. This was bread for the soul. The villagers begged for a taste. Mothers clawed at me, nails tearing skin from my arms. Old men licked crumbs from the dirt. They fought like animals, biting, bleeding, smiling, always smiling. And then I saw them, the green children, standing beyond the firelight. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their laughter rang inside our throats. Every sound we made was theirs. One man fell to the ground, choking. His chest heaved. His stomach bulged out. He vomited out a whole piece of bread, still steaming, still perfect. He begged me for more. It's not food. Not really. It's them. They're inside us now. I feel them moving beneath my ribs, twisting like roots in soil. But it doesn't hurt. No, it feels divine. You'll taste it too soon.
The green kids gave us gifts, toys, tiny dolls. At first, it seemed harmless, was kind. The grown-up villagers gathered in the square, whispering as they stared. Each doll was carved from pale wood to pale, splinters that bled when touched. They weren't ordinary dolls. They were us. Every wrinkle, every scar, every birthmark carved with unnatural precision. A mirror made of wood. I laughed nervously when I saw mine. A jagged crack across its cheek, just like the scar I got playing with my toys. But the longer I looked, the more the dolls I seemed to shimmer green. Like the green bad kids had left a piece of themselves inside it. That night, Mama said the blacksmith was the first to die. They found his body twisted in the square, his back bent backwards, his arms locked at impossible angles. His doll lay beside him, bent the same way. The next night to more, their dolls had already been placed on the fountain's edge, perfectly posed, waiting. Now, the square is full of them. Dozens of tiny villagers, carved into grotesque positions, some face down, some kneeling, some headless. Every morning, more appear. I try not to look at mine, but I can't help it. Tonight, when I walked past, it had changed. Its hands were raised, covering its face. I didn't move it. No one touched it. So why, when I came back just now, are its hands no longer on its face, but reaching outward, reaching for me?
My grandmother used to warn me, child, mirrors are gates. They do not just show you, they hold you. And I thought that was some voodoo moo judo shit. You know what I'm saying? I never believed her. Not until last night. The mirrors here began to betray us. At first, it was small. A woman raising her hand, her reflection lifting it, a heartbeat too late. A boy running past, his image crawling after him like a tired spirit. People laughed nervously, saying maybe they were tired, maybe the glass was cracked. But I know when something is not of God. When I tried it myself, I lifted my palm. The woman in the mirror followed, yes, but her eyes were not on me. They were fixed behind me. She wasn't even on the children. And the children, they had no reflections at all. Just that green glow, smiling from nothing. I called to the villagers, can't you see? Something is wrong here. They only laughed, their teeth wide, their faces stretched. But behind them, in the glass, their reflections did not laugh. They screamed. They pounded against the inside, mouths wide open in terror. I thought they racist, but nah. The children stood by, watching as calmly as crocodiles by the riverbank. And the more the villagers laughed here, the more desperate their reflections became inside. That is when I understood. These things, these green children, they are not simply watching us. They are peeling us away, pulling the soul out, leaving only a hollow body behind. I looked this morning. My reflection still follows me, but she looks weaker, faded. Not the same Black Queen, but we did not know. And when I leaned close, she did not copy me. She leaned closer, her lips pressed against the glass, and she whispered with my own voice, "They are almost done with you."
I was born blind, but I've never been lost. I know these hills by the wind, by the bend of the grass, by the way my sheep breathe when the night turns cold. They've been my eyes for as long as I've had breath in my chest. But now, my sheep do not listen to me. At night, I hear them leaving their pen, not wandering. No, they stand in the field as if carved from stone, every head turned toward the woods. Their bleating is soft, low, like prayer. And when I reach for them, their eyes glow faintly green, as if lit from within. Then the dogs, my loyal dogs, they used to curl at my feet, waiting for my whistle. Now their ears prick at sounds I cannot hear. They bare their teeth at me, but when the children pass by, their tails wag. I tried to stop it. I planted my staff in the ground. I shouted the psalms my mother taught me. For a moment, my flock stirred. For a moment, they remembered. But then the children touched my shoulder. Their hands were light, but the weight, it pressed the breath out of me. My words died in my throat. My staff fell from my hands. And though my eyes are blind, I swear to you, in that instant, I saw green light pouring through the trees. I saw faces not of this world pressing against the dark. And my sheep bowed to them as if they'd always belonged to that glow. This morning, the villagers told me they saw me leading the flock into the forest. They said my eyes were glowing, empty yet alive with something that was not mine. I thought blindness spared me. I thought not seeing them meant I was safe. But no, it made me perfect, a vessel with no sight of my own, ready to carry theirs. And I wonder now, when my sheep bow, when my dogs wag their tails, when I follow those children into the trees, am I guiding them or am I being led?
The clock in the town square has never failed. Through storms, fires, even famine, it kept its rhythm. Its bell marked the hours like the heartbeat of the village. Until last night, I was watching from my window and my hands froze. Not drifted, not broke, froze. The second hand hung in place, trembling as if afraid to move. And then everything else stopped. The birds in the air hung mid-flight. Smoke from chimneys curled and stayed, painted in the sky. Even the wind seemed trapped, pressing against my face but never moving past me. The whole world held its breath, but not the children. They walked through the square freely, their green glow slicing through the stillness. They touched people who were frozen, whispered into ears that could not hear. I swear one of the villagers blinked, though the rest of his body remained stiff as stone. And then the children turned, their heads tilted toward me all at once. As if I was the only thing still moving, time lurched back. The clock's hand jumped forward, but hours had vanished. The moon leapt across the sky, the stars shifted places. The villagers woke as if nothing happened, but I watched them. I saw. Their hands shook. Their mouths twitched into smiles they didn't mean to make. And when I asked where those missing hours went, they just laughed. That's when I understood the clock didn't stop. We did. The children had carried us somewhere else, made us live another life in a time we can't remember. And every hour we lose belongs to them now. Tick.
I used to talk to him in this house, my husband, even after he was gone. His chair above the fire, his boots under the bed. They made the silence bearable. But now the house speaks back. It started with a stain above his chair. Green, wet. I touched it and felt it pulse. A heartbeat where no heart should be. By morning the walls were weeping. Thick streams, sweet-smelling, sickly. Neighbors pressed their hands to it, whispering that it was warm, alive. Some even licked it from their palms. I pressed my ear against the plaster and heard it. A voice, his voice, my husband's, muffled, pleading, calling my name like he used to in the dark. That night, the wall opened. I saw a man walk into it, swallowed whole. No scream, no fight, just gone. And when I pressed my hand thereafter, something pressed back, fingers, scratching. Now the dripping covers everything. My clothes, my bed, my skin. The children trail their hands along the walls as if feeding them, and everywhere they touch, the heartbeat grows louder. I know it isn't him, I know. But when the house whispers in his voice, when it begs me to come closer, I can't stop myself. Because the cruelest part isn't that the walls lie, it's that they lie in the only voice I still want to hear.
The church kept a ledger. Births, marriages, deaths, the whole memory of the village pressed into its pages. I opened it yesterday, and the pages were blank. Not torn, not burned, erased. And then it began. A mother calling for her child, but forgetting his name halfway through. A man reaching for his wife, whispering the wrong word. The more time they spent near the children, the quicker the name slipped away. At first it was small things, son, sister, friend. But yesterday, old Harker stumbled into the square, clutching his head, screaming. Who am I? His neighbors tried to calm him, but their own voices faltered. They couldn't remember him either. I told myself I'd hold on, that I'd repeat my husband's name to myself until it was burned into my tongue. But last night, when I whispered it in bed, something else whispered it back from the walls. The children were outside, their green glow spilling across the street, and when they looked in my direction, the name on my lips, his name, dissolved. It melted away like sugar in water. They aren't stealing our bodies. Not yet. They're stealing our names, ourselves. Because every name they take, every identity they erase, makes them a little more human. Until you realize they're the villagers. One by one.
I can still taste that first loaf, the one I baked for the children, the one that turned black before dawn, sweet as honey, soft as spring wheat. Though my teeth came away stained, my lips painted dark. The villagers laughed at me, said I looked cursed, but I only wanted more. Now it's worse. Nothing lasts anymore. Bread sours overnight. Fruit writhes with worms before it's even picked. Milk rots as it's carried home. But still we eat. Weed with fever, with madness, shoving spoiled scraps into our mouths, laughing with black teeth. Last night, I woke with soil between my teeth, nails torn, gums raw, mouth full of dirt. I don't remember crawling to the fields, don't remember tearing roots out of the ground like an animal. But my belly aches with it still, and the sweetness lingers on my tongue. And it isn't just me. I saw a man on his knees in the square, chewing grass like a beast, his eyes rolled back, glowing faintly green. When he choked and vomited, what spilled out wasn't grass. It was bread, golden, fresh, as though his body itself had become the oven. That's when I knew we are not eating, we are being eaten. Poor, we are ovens, flesh and bone rising with their hunger. I thought my blackened mouth was a curse, but no, it was only the beginning, a mark, a sign of what I had already become, And the worst part, I don't want to stop. Every bite feels holy. Every swallow feels like prayer. Each time I feed, I feel them moving in me, twisting, filling, rising. I thought I was a baker, but I am only the crust now. The children are what rise inside me. Eat, eat, eat.
The bells were always our anchor, through famine, through plague, through death. They rang. Their sound told us we were alive, that God still heard us. Until tonight, I climbed the tower at dusk, ready to call evening prayer. I pulled the rope. I felt the weight of the iron above me swing, but no sound followed. Not a chime, not a whisper. The bell moved, but the air stayed dead. I tried again, harder. Nothing. The silence was so complete. I heard the scrape of my own bones shifting, and then I heard it, a giggle. From below, the children stood in the nave, their green lights spilling like lantern flame. They watched me tug the rope again and again, as though they wanted to see me fail. By the time I descended, the villagers were already gathered. They weren't afraid. They smiled. They said they could hear the bells inside their heads, that the children were ringing them in their hearts, and as they spoke, their mouths twitched in rhythm, as if pulled by invisible strings. That's when I realized the silence wasn't an accident. The bells hadn't died. They'd been replaced. The children no longer need stone or iron to summon us. They only need our voices, our bodies. Last night, I woke from sleep with blood on my tongue, my lips cracked, my throat raw. My neighbor said she heard me ringing out the hour with my own screams. The bells are gone. The church is gone. All that remains is the silence, and inside that silence, their laughter.
I've walked these woods all my life. I know where the river bends, where the moss grows thickest, where the path splits but always returns. You can't get lost here, not if you've lived here as long as I have. But since the children came, the forest has begun to move. It started with small things, a tree I'd passed 100 times, now standing in a different place. Stones that once marked the trail, gone by morning. At first, I thought I was tired, that grief and hunger were playing tricks. But then I followed the road out of the village, a straight path worn by cartwheels and hooves. I walked until my feet blistered, and yet, when I looked up, there was the church steeple. I was back where I began. The forest isn't letting us leave. Worse still, it isn't the same when you return. Doors are on the wrong side of houses. Fields slope the opposite way. Neighbors' faces are familiar, but their eyes are not. Last night, I saw the widow wandering among the trees, calling her husband's name. She vanished into the pines, and when I ran after her, I found her footprints in the mud. Dozens of them, circling back, looping endlessly, as though she'd been walking there for years. But when I asked her this morning where she'd gone, she smiled, said she'd never left her bed. The forest shifts with the children. It bends for them, and each time it changes. I feel it taking something from us. Land, memory, time. We used to say the woods fed us, gave us fire, shelter, game. Now I think we feed it. And I know, if I step outside again, it won't be the same forest waiting for me.
I wasn't supposed to see this again. Out there between the pines, I found it. A door. No frame, no walls. Just standing in the dirt, black as burned wood, silent but alive. The surface rippled when the wind touched it. Like water. Like it was waiting. I know what it is. Back in the service, we heard rumors. Files passed between hands. Redacted until they were nothing but shadows. A project buried so deep it didn't exist, we called it the door, and there it was. I should have walked away. But my training failed me. I stepped closer. My boot sank into the soil, soft, wet like blood under the grass. And when I reached for the handle, it was warm, pulsing. That's when I heard them, voices, not radio static, not ghosts, familiar voices. The ones who disappeared, villagers, children, all pressed together, screaming, laughing, begging. I froze, because I knew this wasn't a passage, it was a holding place. And the missing weren't gone, they were inside. I don't know what's worse than that I've seen it before, or that this time it knows me.
We discovered something magnificent. Children. They were always the key. Their little bodies absorbed the energy like sponges. Adults? They screamed in laughter and melted into nothing. Boring. But the children. Oh, they adapted. They glowed. Their veins lit up under the skin like rivers of emerald fire. And when they turned to face us, smiling, not their smiles. No, the light smile. I knew we had found perfection. We tried to kill them, of course. Needles through the heart, blades through the skull, fire until the skin bubbled and blackened. And every time, they pulled themselves back together. Every failure only made them stronger. Do you know what it feels like to stand on the edge of creation? To watch a child dissolve into light, then step back out, glowing, smiling, unbreakable? It is beautiful. It makes me happy seeing children suffer. However, we stopped calling them children. They were our carriers, our vessels. Yet I saw it in their eyes. They remembered. They knew what we did to them, and they hated us. And that hate made them perfect. Sometimes at night, I would walk the labs alone. I would hear them giggling in the vents, see their faces pressed against the glass. Hundreds of them, their mouths wide, their teeth black, their eyes burning green, watching me, waiting for me. We didn't create the green children. We revealed them. We fed them. And the light keeps them, reshapes them, remakes them. They are eternal. They are exquisite. They are mine.
Play with us, Doctor.
Shh, I have to speak quietly. If I talk too loud, they will hear me. The night the forest turned green, everything changed. The trees glowed brighter than the moon. The whole village froze. My son stood in the light. His eyes shimmered green. He turned toward me and whispered, "Mama," warm. I begged him to come back. He did not move. He only smiled. The light lifted him from the ground. His arms hung loose. His legs trembled. The smile stayed. Too wide. Too wrong. I ran to him. I swear I did. But the closer I came, the farther away he was. The forest bent around me. My steps carried me in circles. He called my name. His voice was clear, but his lips did not move. Then his body broke. His skin flickered. His bones rattled. He unraveled into strands of green light. His shadow twitched on the dirt, clawing, reaching, until it too was gone. And in the glow I saw them, small faces, small hands, pressed against the light. Not strangers, the missing, the stolen, their eyes black, their mouths stretched wide, all smiling. I thought they were gone forever, but they were waiting. The green children are ours. Her whisper lowers, close in the listener's ear. Shh. Do you hear that silence?
Morning came quiet, too quiet. No birds, no dogs, no wind. Just silence stretched then over the whole village. I walked down the road. I told myself it was fine, that I was only checking the fences. But I saw the tracks. Bare feet, dozens of them, small, all pointed the same way. Back toward us. At first I thought they were old, but the prints were fresh, damp, still sinking into the earth as if the children had just walked by. When I reached my door, he was there, my boy, standing in the hallway. Same clothes, same hair, same small frame. The one the light had taken. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. His eyes glowed faint green, and that smile, it stretched too wide. Behind him, the hallway was darker than it should have been. Shadows moving like water, more shapes gathering. Small shoulders, small faces, all of them smiling. I kept my voice calm. I told him, "You can't be here." But my hands were shaking. My chest was shaking. The neighbors had the same. Children on their steps. Children inside their kitchens. Mothers sobbing. Fathers begging. Doors that had been locked opening anyway, swinging wide like they'd never been shut. Some villagers called it a blessing. They said prayers had been answered. But I knew better. The children weren't returned. They were sent. They sat in our chairs. They touched our walls. They waited still as statues until night fell. And then the whole village hummed with sound. Not voices, not singing. Something deeper, like the bones of the earth vibrating. I stood in my kitchen, the lamp flickering, and I knew the truth. They aren't ours. They never were. They only wear our children's faces because they know it hurts more that way. They're inside every house now, sitting, smiling, waiting, and when they're ready, they'll open the door again.
The village looks alive again. Doors stand open. Windows glow with lanterns. Laughter drifts through the streets. For the first time in months, it feels happy. Children play in the square, chasing one another in circles. Men sing old songs as they mend fences. Women gather at the well, their hands clasped, smiling wide. If you pass through, you believe we were saved. You believe the green children brought joy back to us. But look closer. The laughter doesn't rise or fall. It loops, the same note repeated. The songs never change verse. The games never end. The women's hands are clasped too tight, their nails cutting into skin, blood sliding down their wrists as they keep smiling. And those smiles, they don't move with the faces. They stretch wider and wider, as if pulled from inside. I see their skin thinning, their cheeks trembling, their eyes glowing faint green. The men's songs rattle in their throats, their voices hollow, their teeth black. The children who play never tire, never stumble. Their shadows twitch a beat behind them, laughing a fraction too late. It looks like happiness. It feels like revival. But it's not life returning. It's life being drained. The green children stand among them, glowing faintly, their heads tilted, always watching. Wherever they go, villagers lean closer, smiling wider, as if tethered to that light. I thought the village was alive again, but it's not alive. It's a mask, a festival without end, a celebration for no one. And beneath the joy, beneath the laughter, the truth grows louder in my bones. We are not rejoicing. We are being emptied.
I was never supposed to speak of this. My name is House Dolian, ex-military. I wasn't a scientist, not a creator. I was a guard. A body, a gun, a shadow standing watch at the edge of the project. They said it would change everything. A new world, clean and green. A light that seeped from the roots of the forest, older than fire, stronger than any machine. Energy that could outlast us all. No more war. No more hunger. Just light. At first it worked. Small tests. Bulbs that glowed without wires. Water that boiled without flame. Fields that sprouted in half the time. The scientists swore they could turn the whole world peaceful, and I believed them. But then they turned it on children, not to harm them. No, they thought children could hold the light better than adults. Resilient, adaptable. They smiled when it filled them. The room cheered. It looked like a miracle. Until it didn't. The smile stretched too wide. The eyes glowed too long. The light twisted their voices, made them hum songs we never taught them. We tried to end it, needles, blades, fire. Nothing worked. The light kept them. And the scientists, They changed too. They whispered to walls that bled green. They laughed at clocks that stopped. They carved dolls of themselves and claimed they're alive. They said the forest was speaking, telling them what to do. One by one, they disappeared into the woods, into the light, into the children. I stayed. Not out of duty, out of fear. I thought I was the observer, recording what I saw, guarding the gate. But the truth is, I was part of it too. The children you see now aren't strangers. They're what's left of us. The lost hours, the black bread, the names we forgot, it all led here. We wanted peace, a brighter future. We made it, but it isn't ours anymore. I wasn't a creator, I was a witness, and now so are you.